the DeFUD Podcast. Excited to bring the gang together for this DeFUD Acrew Podcast special. So Nancy here, I might recognize this from the DeFUD Podcast, where we break down topics in infra and security. Currently venture partner at Felicis Ventures, previously general manager for data protection at AWS, and one of the early PMs at a company called Rubrik in the data protection space.
This is Ashish. I'm the co-host on the DeFUD podcast with Nancy. Previously ran security organizations at Spotnana, UiPath, and 2K Games, and spent a considerable amount of time doing security engineering at Microsoft and Google. These days, I'm working with a lot of startups and, thinking on some of my own ideas on how to create a security product.
Awesome. My name is Mark Kraynak. I'm one of the co-founders, one of Asad's co-founders here at Acrew Capital. My background is enterprise B2B security. My longest stint in that was pretty good run at Imperva from Series A to IPO and beyond. And if you go back far enough, I have the obvious background for security investor, which is graduate degree in creative writing of poetry, which I use every day.
I'm sure that probably contributes to some pretty fascinating RCAs.
Yeah, I haven't written any of my memos actually in iambic pentameter yet, but still thinking about it.
Yeah, despite a lot of peer pressure from me to do that. I'm Asad, one of the other co-founders, partners at Acrew. For those who aren't familiar, Acrew Capital is an early and growth stage venture firm. We're very collaborative, we're very values driven, and we invest in three thematic areas: data and security, fintech, and health. And we're very thesis driven within those areas. So we're trying to think about what comes next in each of those. And Mark and I in particular spend a lot of time on data and security. So excited to chat with the two of you.
Yeah, so let's start with kind of my favorite topic, right? And typically, just using the DeFUD series as an example, when we talk to different founders, we usually love to start off with, what are some things that are piquing your interest out there these days, right? What are some top of mind problems, challenges, trends out there? Maybe we can do a round robin from the four of us, right? So I'll maybe, kick it off. Right. One trend that I'm seeing, really permeate these days is, instead of shift left, with this concept of start left, right? So for example, what companies like ChainGuard are doing to creating, vulnerability-free base images, right? Really shifting that vuln management as far left as possible. I'm a fan of that trend, right? As a former engineering leader, that saves us a ton of hassle, especially later down the road when you're ready to deploy customer-facing features. I'm a big fan of that trend.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One thing that I'm seeing, I guess this is the DeFUD podcast, the thing I have a little bit of fear, uncertainty, and doubt about is that AI is coming for us all at some level. Like, the attacker use of AI is much more forgiving than the defender use of AI. And I think the market has to adjust. I don't actually think the thing to do is to use AI to fight AI. I think one thing that we're starting to see is focus on the humans and how do you help them as opposed to how do you try to fight the bots. So that's one thing that I think you're going to see more, hopefully successful technologies around helping humans do better in security versus the other way around. What
about you, Ashish?
I'm hearing a lot of things. Last 24 months have been quite interesting. It's in the last 24 months, I've spent quite a bit of time looking at the startup world, some of the trends, been very deeply clued into the black hat and the RSA scene on what people are announcing, and just talking to a lot of customers as well. I think the space of identity, I kind of agree with Mark, is up for something big, something really appending in identity consolidation. I think there's a huge opportunity there in that regard. And there's a couple of sub-bullets to that: human versus non-human, governance versus access control versus JIT. There's too many sub-bullets to that they're bound to do some kind of convergence. The second big trend, again, I kind of agree with Mark that there's a huge wave of AI. But counter to what most people would say, I think the trend in AI is to not over-index on AI. The real people are really talking about not over-indexing on AI for the power of defense and offense in that sense. Really actually use that as a assistant more than be the core of a solution. I think we're still a little bit far from claiming AI for AI kind of offense defense mechanism. So there's some neat things happening there. I think the agentic frameworks and frontier models doing a lot of good stuff. They're very useful. They're going to increase the productivity and collaboration more than they're going to become the the tools in the end.
Yeah,
And then
I really agree with that. Sorry to cut in. I think that when AI sort of first became hyped, it looked like it was going to be really good at helping humans be more productive in certain areas. And then, the hype cycle goes up. Everybody thinks it's going to do everything. But in the end, when it hits that plateau, I think usually it does about what people thought at first, which I think is making humans be better at certain things.
yeah, that's the second trend. And I think thirdly, I'm seeing a lot of consolidation and activity around moving the controls to the endpoint away from the network and then combining identity layers on top of that. So you will see the SASE and SSE space sort of converge towards the endpoint with the hybrid workforce and remote workforce scenarios and people not wanting to have multiple agents on the endpoint. Equivalent DLP-like capabilities or MDM-like capabilities or access control capabilities are kind of converging to the endpoint. There's too many companies out there that I can't ignore at this point. And then somewhere in this mix is this idea of browser-based security, like browser being the frontier of everything. So I think that between the browser and endpoint, something has to win in the long run.
So I think we must be in the business here making some predictions. What's going to win, endpoint or browser?
I think it's depending on the market segment. The upper market segment will converge towards the endpoint because it's key part of their control structure. But the smaller market will probably say, you know what, bring your own device. Browser is my endpoint. So browser wins there, essentially.
That's interesting because I think the shape of the market is the first big customers for enterprise browser are big enterprises.
That's interesting.
My perception.
Yeah, I would say that large enterprises want to make it easier to manage access and websites and what have you. They love the idea of browser, but they would never get rid of their MDM and all of that other stuff on the endpoint. That's still part of the game. I'm talking about a full replacement. Endpoint means nothing. Browser is everything. That's the lower end of the market where, you have 100, 200 employees. Yeah, bring your own computer, but use my browser. I think there's a clear-cut case of not having to worry about managing the endpoint, but just manage the browser. So endpoint is not a dependency. But yeah, the hybrid world will exist. People like the idea of not having to worry about, website threats and, web client side threats, and browsers are really good at that. They really don't want to work with network-centric approaches, so browser becomes the edge, so on and so forth. So, the time will tell in that regard.
Yeah.
And what do you think, Asad?
Well, Ashish made multiple predictions, so I'm going to cheat and do the same thing. I guess two things we're thinking a lot about these days. One is, what's the future of estates or domains in security? Historically, if you look at a lot of the big outcomes, it's companies that can win one of those estates or domains, whether it's identity or endpoint or network or maybe the meta layer. And new companies can either choose to play to win in one of those domains, or they can think about what's coming next. And we're maybe biased. I think the jury's out on, is AI going to be a net new domain? Is it going to be something that partially filters into multiple existing domains? When you become a VC, they make you sign a pledge to talk your book. So I'll mention we led the seed in Protect AI, co-led the seed in Protect AI. And those guys obviously have a point of view on where that world goes. The other area that Mark and I have been doing some thinking around and meeting some pretty interesting people in is, what's the future of human security? And could that potentially be a new area? The human is still sort of, in a lot of security chains, ultimately the sort of weak link, quote unquote. Often in the past, it's been a pretty tricky problem because there's a lot of unstructured data. There's things like sentiment and emotion and live conversations that can play a role in being attack vectors. And this is not a surprise to anyone here. We now have technology to make much better sense of unstructured data, and maybe the opportunity to sort of play a more engaging role with humans as a security solution. So we're thinking a lot about that and where that goes, and could that be something new, or does that fit into an existing area? The other thing I'll say just quickly on Ashish's note, which I completely agree with regards to like, how does AI fit in and how core should it be, is I see a lot of teams thinking about and struggling with investing in building IP around use of AI. Let's say it's something like maybe you're fine-tuning a model to fit your purposes. And then 6 months later, something new comes out and everything you did has been leapfrogged and sort of commoditized, right? And so where do you kind of really build core IP, and to what extent can you build technological IP versus a moat in some other form? And how much should you, right? What's the right level of resourcing? And I don't think there's an easy answer there. The best practice seems to be changing every month or two, but it's a challenge for people who are building in this world.
Yeah, I kind of resonate with the couple of points that you said, Asad. Let me start from the back end. My personal research on figuring out how to best utilize AI in the context of security is sort of going in this direction of you're absolutely right that the models, frontier models change and they become better and better. And that's actually only good news. It's not a bad news as far as the builder is concerned, right? But the idea of how to leverage, where do we separate traditional systems from AI systems? I think more work has to be done on organization of the data so that the right level of frontier model layer can be built on top of that. Expecting tuning a model to a domain or a purpose or a task and having it do magical things is going to be a fallacy. You still need the strong relational data underneath to be able for it to pull its magic. I think my own personal experiments in this space have kind of proven to be sort of giving me that kind of thesis now that data organization, when done properly, and then coupled with the AI reasoning and frontier models, they actually work quite well, not to the point of replacing the human, but then becoming an ambient intelligence to offer the right advice, right action, prompt the right action, and not just be somebody that's something that's just taking input from the user. They can actually provide input back to the user, which goes also very much back to your first point, which is the human security angle. I think the fact that people are distracted, the fact that people are easy to deceive, ambient intelligence, which is still core around contextual data and information, that prompts the user to not make a mistake. It expects that user is going to make a mistake somewhere. I think that angle of human security powered by AI has legs, but it's a big technical problem with respect to what context to grab against what action. And I think
Yeah.
anybody who cracks that will probably win the human security angle in that sense.
And the other half of our day job, we do investing in the data world. And I think security's always been a data heavy, I would say, domain. I think one of the early opportunities in security is going to be a little bit less security orientated and a lot more data oriented. So how do you get that starting point? And I think AI can help you get that starting point to organize the data from lots of different disparate sources. And then you can bring another different one or maybe the same one that runs on top of that does interesting things. But I think you're right. Like you got to start with getting your arms around the right context first.
Absolutely true. And I'm so glad you said use AI for data collection and then again use AI for data reasoning. They are two separate things. The grunt work that used to take a lot of time to connect disparate systems, I think agents are pretty good at that. You can call functions across APIs, across RPAs, across whatever the hell you want. You can actually start to enrich your data organization just by using LLMs. Just outsource the grunt work there. But you still have to sort of have your own schema and normalization on top before you present this back to a reasoning engine, which is powered by AI.
Yeah.
Well, and
I think you're
actually
getting
one
at something.
thread on the data side, maybe taking us down a different path a little bit here, right? Is I feel like with the first wave of, let's say, DSPM players, we didn't quite play out that full vision. And that's actually a thread that I'm saying, should we spend more time on what this category could have been? We're all talking about like data curation, right? The importance, for example, of synthetic data, right? Especially for training models for specific purposes. Like, is there a net new, data privacy or data security play that the first wave didn't accomplish? What do you guys think?
Well, so I come from a data security background. I was at Imperva for 13 years, and we had a product in it was database activity monitoring, which is like a pretty narrow swath of, I think, what you talk about in data security. And what I learned in those 13 years is that data security is very, very, very difficult. And the reason is it's easy to break a lot of stuff. And I think people don't have a very realistic view of how data is really used, just at the human sort of gut check level. I think we have a lot of fundamental disconnects. So I always kind of thought DSPM was going to be a tough market. And I still think that. What I do think is going to happen is that AI is going to force a different kind of data security, and it's going to be, and that people need to focus on where the value is. The poster child kind of example I use for this is what Reddit and now I guess Twitter have done, which is for years and years, they had very open interfaces. You could see all the data, and now they're not. and you have to pay. And that's because not so much they care about privacy, they care about who gets to monetize on that data. And so they are protecting their data in a way, but just what it means in this context is less, don't let people see things, and more, don't let people see things unless they pay me for it. And I think that's a really different point of view on data security than I think a lot of DSPMs came to the market around. And maybe for good reason, because they probably had compliance driving some of the use cases. But I actually think the real data security markets driven by AI is going to be a monetization marketplace, not a data privacy driven dynamic.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say, this is kind of going back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, is security market innovation is driven, of course, by what threat actors are up to, and then what technology shifts are ongoing. And what Ashish said about the importance of what your data looks like as an organization is so core now to a lot of companies that are thinking about doing business. I think we're so early in building and working with AI, and I think there's an increasing awareness that the accessibility, cleanliness, structure, level of centralization of your data as an organization is so important. Because everything else we do is, the best practices are still all over the place. I mean, you could put a text prompt into GPT versus the same thing in a PDF and get a different result, right? Like, we're still very early in actually working with this stuff. And so the data becomes really important, because that's what's getting you ready. And I think there's an increasing awareness. I think some organizations have really led the way. I mean, Shopify is the one that comes to mind for me. Since like 2022, they've had a pretty open effort in getting their data as an organization to a place where they kind of feel ready for anything. And so there's almost this philosophical shift in how people think about data. And that, I think, has really meaningful implications for sort of timing of security innovation that layers on top. So I think, to answer your prompt of like, is something coming next, is totally the right one. We think a lot about, if you look historically at security cycles, you're usually either creating a net new market, or you're sort of building on perfecting an existing market. You know, maybe the poster child for the latter could be Wiz, where they said we're better, we're faster, we're easier than what came before. But that relied on something having come before, right? And so I think we might be in a place where, you know, I mean, you could see maybe, I think historically, data hasn't really been an independent security market, kind of part of AppSec, kind of part of some of the other domains, depending on how you look at it. But we might be at a place now where the importance of clean data is so meaningful that, of course, that creates trust and safety and security and governance obligations on top. And the timing for that and the scale of that might be really different than even 2, 3, 4 years ago. So I think it's the right question for sure, and I really agree with the underlying sentiment.
I see. So you do believe in this emergence of a true DSPM category?
I don't know if I'd call it DSPM, but it's D something. So I'm going to take the contrarian view. I do not. I think DSPM is part of XSPM, and there'll be a posture management market. I think that's the Wiz market. I think almost everything in posture management is going to look like a nail for some kind of hammer. And so I don't think that the posture management market will have separate subsegments for different domains. I mean, probably in a practical sense, there'll be some vendors that are better at data, some that are better at applications, some that are better at infra. But I think if you think about it at the aggregate level, I don't think it's a separate market. I think it's a feature of the SPM market of some sort.
Well, speaking of SPMs, Ashish and I just heard a latest one is BSPM this week. Actually meeting the founder today. He's in town from New York, of Eon.io, which just came out as stealth. And so perhaps that'll be the latest acronym that we can see in our Gartner.
What does the B stand for?
Backups. Backup. Posture management.
That seems kind of niche-y, I gotta say. It seems kind of small, but that could be different, because that's not necessarily a security only use case. It's maybe a resiliency use case. But yeah, that seems kind of niche-y to me. I don't know what you guys think.
I think hot and cold sites and backups in context of ransomware are becoming a security problem. So I think it has a leg there as well.
Well, I think, yeah, storage generally is, I think, quite a big market. So I don't know that I would say that one has to roll up to the rest of SPM. That'd be interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing that I've noticed in the Eon narrative is, you know, it really resonated with me in the sense that when we think about backups, we tend to think about just the storage piece or the data piece, right? I think being able to flip up and down an arbitrary piece of infrastructure, which is not just data, is a need of the hour for many businesses, given that takedowns happen all the time, ransomware things happen all the time. And by the way, regulations like GDPR require you to have high amount of availability and multi-region this and that data sovereignty. So I think I witnessed that problem firsthand, and it was very hard to say that I have the ability to spin up and down an entire site. So yeah, so I think extending the idea of backup to more than storage infra and having infrastructure as code and being able to spin up and spin down at scale, it's a huge value prop in the end. And SRE teams or dev teams struggle with getting that kind of finesse today.
Yeah, I'm going to take a page out of Asad's book when we talk our book. We have a company in our portfolio called Haiku, just spelled kind of funny, HYCU. They're in the backup and recovery space. But one of the things they're finding that really resonates with what you said is backing up the configuration of SaaS and also your identities. And so your AD recovery is a big part of resiliency beyond just, as you said, the data piece of it. So
yeah,
that fits.
So going back to something that Asad said earlier, it piqued my interest when he was describing the data estates and how they might evolve, right? It and how does security sort of shift as a result of that? I think the era of snowflakes and Databricks is a good proxy to understand how security shifts. If this new idea of data must be organized slightly differently for the new world of AI, right? So there were business processes that forced the industry to migrate from traditional data management techniques to like the Salesforce of the world or the warehouses of the world, right? And then security didn't evolve separately on top of that, it adapted around it, right? So similarly, in the AI-driven movement of data organization, I think security will have to adopt because first the business has to win on what their actual cause is, and then security has to adapt. So finding a new vertical around that early on is going to be very hard. We need to see what the shape of the new data architecture looks like before we can add security back onto it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's something that we talk a lot about. And I think AI is a good example. I'm not sure that the patterns of AI applications are static enough and mature enough that you really know everything you need to do to secure it yet. And I would say my model for how new estates and security develop, the underlying thing has to kind of develop first. And almost every estate in security, that's how it's happened. Identity started after the mainframe was, this is years and years ago. Like the first estate was identity. That was almost everything you needed on the mainframe, but because everything was in one place. But like the compute happened first, and then security, and then client server, network security. I think the advent of web and Web 2.0 kicked off application security in a more major way. So I think the same thing is probably going to be true for different patterns. Well, that could be for AI. I actually think for edge and OT, same thing, although we're probably farther along in understanding those patterns. But I think that pattern of the underlying thing developing first, the business finding the use case and the value, and then security coming later is definitely something I believe.
Well, speaking of identity, why do we feel like there hasn't been like a major identity platform, right? Same as, for example, CrowdStrike for Endpoint, Palo Alto for network. I mean, there's been, I think, multiple attempts, I feel like, right? SailPoint, CyberArk, Okta, do we think that any of those will be the main identity platform? Or do you feel like one of the new IGA players is going to grow out of that initial wedge and become the platform?
We have two horses in this. So I think it's happening now, I would say. And I think that I would argue that the way that the identity market happened is you had security-oriented identity, really strong identity products on the mainframe. They all had to change for distributed computing. But I would argue that the identity infrastructure for humans at least has really evolved. And there's a dominant player there is probably Microsoft, but you have Okta, you have Ping, and I think that's a pretty big estate, but it's more like connectivity oriented. It's not really a security market. And I think now people are realizing, especially with the kind of hyper hybridization of work, that identity matters a lot more. And you're seeing, I think, two things happen. One, I do think there will be a broader identity platform. We have a horse in that race, which is Silverfort. We're just trying to create a broad platform from ITDR to other things. I actually think the non-human identity market will be separate from that. And it's at a very different state of development. The underlying connectivity infrastructure has to be developed first. And then
I saw that you recently made a bet in Ambit.
Yeah. So that's my other, so Ambit, that's the bet on Ambit, is first have the underlying connectivity infrastructure that replaces vaults and long running, hard to rotate secrets. And then I think on top of that, there will be the security market. But I think first that underlying connectivity of making it work for non-humans in a much better way has to happen. And the reality is, a couple of years ago, or maybe a decade ago, you had monolithic applications. There weren't that many non-human identities compared to what you have today. When you decompose applications into microservices, you inflate the number of identities by tens or hundreds or thousands. And that's a very different problem that I don't think, vaults and long running keys can work for. So I think trying to govern that better is a tough approach. First, let's find the infrastructure for access management. So what Okta does for humans, let's do this for machines. And then I think you can have a security platform on top.
And the why now piece actually is very compelling, right? For, why this machine to machine connectivity or attestation, maybe another word for it, right? Because Spiffy actually came out almost a decade ago, right?
Yeah.
At Google as an open source project. And that, I'm sure you guys are well aware, right? Spun off a company called Sightail.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, why is the timing different now?
Yeah. So first, I think a couple things are different. One, we looked pretty closely at that. One of the first things I wanted to look at when I became a VC, which was 2017, right around the time Skytail was founded. First of all, I think Spiffy is really, really hard to implement. It's open heart surgery. You have to go in and touch all your applications and redo a bunch of stuff. And I think that's hard. And that's kind of specific to that technology. But I think two things have happened. One, cloud native has continued its march forward. So that identity explosion for non-humans has happened. And then hackers have figured that out. And there's blood in the water. And now they're starting to exploit the weaknesses in that really major attack surface. And that is another organizing contract for how I think security markets develop, which is nothing happens because it's kind of like you're trying to give people vitamins and they don't really care and they haven't been attacked. And then a couple of attacks happen. The attack community focuses on that, and then a lot of attacks happen, and a couple of really big ones. And I think you're starting to see, pretty repeated abuse of non-human identities. And so that's going to make people feel pain, and then they'll take action. Unfortunately, you would have loved that they had figured that out 5 years ago and then got themselves ready for it, but that's not how humans work. They have to feel the pain first. So that's what I think about why now is you're seeing the exploits, and then people react to exploits.
I see. It goes back to Asad's point, I think, on the human security side. Any companies there that, have stuck out to you?
It's interesting. There's a relatively mature market on training, because I think today the current actual state of the market that's in use is training for individuals. And I think there are some interesting companies there, but I don't think training is going to work. I don't think you can train a human to be vigilant enough and knowledgeable enough. So if your answer for protecting against phishing and other kinds of social engineering is train your humans, which everybody has to do, by the way, because it's a compliance thing, I just don't think you're going to get much progress there. Some companies that we've seen, we spent some time with a company called Amplifier Security recently. It's got a very good approach there. They're really early, but I think they have some really interesting bones in the business for how to do this. We met with a company called Cloaked, which is more about individuals and privacy, but it's like, how do you as an individual, and eventually this I think would translate into the corporate environment, improve your security posture kind of out on the internet at large and reduce the likelihood that you're going to be targeted. So those are two. I don't know, Asad, if you'd add any others.
I'm going to cheat again and say I think this might be one of those markets where actually a lot of the conversations we're having, going back to the timing question, right? It's like people who are starting to think about it, and the shape of the problem is becoming more apparent, and there's like this technology driver of being able to use unstructured data. And so I would say proportionally, the conversations we're having in and around this space, it's like 80%, if the 20% is companies like Amplifier and some others, 80% is people who are sort of just in and around the idea and thinking about what the right approach is, because it feels like that's where we are in the technological and sort of business readiness cycle. This all goes back to Ashish's point of like, you got to know what the architecture and the best practice and the business incentive look like before you can build the security thing on top. And it feels like that's where that market is. I think part of it, by the way, was a lot of your discussion around identity. I think maybe that market is maturing, and obviously a pretty meaningful percentage of breaches tend to be identity related, but they also tend to be human related. And so there's this sort of parallel development that's pushing the importance of human, I think, up in the eyes of many practitioners and CISOs. And that then obviously makes its way to potential founders or people who are in those seats who are thinking about ways to productize it. So my honest answer is I think it's really, really early. I think it's an area we're very interested in. So if either you know or if anyone's listening to this who's thinking about this space, we'd love to talk to you. But it's also early. And it's one of those spaces, I'll just sort of end on a maybe a slight non sequitur, but there's a lot of discussion in security, I'll call it, around platformization and consolidation and where are we in the market and where all of the sort of big picture, like meta questions around building businesses. And we feel like despite a lot of noise, and maybe this is unintuitive, I don't know, it feels like a really good time to build an early stage security company. We'll feel like we're kind of at the tail of the consolidation and it's sort of cleaned up some market spaces. And there's a bunch of places where now there's new opportunity to start something that new. We obviously feel like potentially human is one, but there's other spaces too where that's happening. So that's my non-answer, Nancy.
Spoken like a true investor.
So one tangent of thought while we were talking about identity and consolidation and how this might actually work out in the future, I find one particular thing interesting in that space that, when we talk about consolidation, it's not just about the technical pieces coming together, right? The market segmentation and how teams are organized in our customers make a big difference to how consolidation happens, right? And identity is one of those areas which I've been sort of seeing more and more coming under the remit of security people. So especially with the cloud explosion and what have you. And that changes how the consolidation may occur in the sense that in my last two jobs, I had a report to me and identity became a de facto problem for me as a CISO, right? And you start to look at dividends very differently. When it is not your tool, you think it's a liability. When it's your tool, you think of it as an asset, right? As a CISO, right? So that secular trend of identity moving towards security ownership has a deep impact on who provides the most value in and around identity. And those players who provide value in and around identity, whether they are MDM pieces, whether they are other pieces, will tend to perform better in those organizations where identity has moved under security. And if that trend continues, I think there is tailwinds for such a play in the end.
Yeah, ultimately, I think that's a tailwind for the dynamic we were talking about, which is I think now is the time that you're going to see an identity security platform emerge. I feel pretty strongly that that platform needs to be a layer above access management and across different access management layers, because I don't think you're going to go swap out the complete identity infrastructure. And so anything that lives inside a given identity platform is probably not going to have a broad enough reach. So I think the physics of that is going to be a new market. I think maybe it's a whole estate around identity security that is cross-platform, and actually it's driven to a large extent by CISOs that want a tool that can handle this problem and have the responsibility.
Yeah. But by the way, I think, Ashish, there's an underlying fundamental point you're making, which is a really important one, which is who owns the thing can be an interesting leading indicator of the readiness of the market. We just did, a couple of colleagues, and Mark and I, we did this sort of AI safety security survey amongst a bunch of practitioners. And one really interesting learning is you talk to people and you ask them, like, who kind of owns security, privacy, alignment, risk in your AI work, your Gen AI work in particular on your team? And it's a really diffuse set of answers. A lot of people do say security, but it's like half the people say security. A lot of people are saying engineering technology teams. That's like CTO, chief AI officer. A lot of people say legal. It's not a majority or anything, but it's a meaningful subset. And some put it under product, and then there's a long tail. So it's very diffuse. And I think that you have to see an obvious cluster or two before the market's really ready for sort of a more repeatable approach, and might be happening in multiple spaces, but that set of numbers really stood out to us.
Yeah, my organizing analogy for this is kind of a little bit of a tangent. If you're at a party and you have kids in a pool and everybody's responsible for watching the kids in the pool, it's a bad thing because nobody's actually responsible. And I feel like and bad things happen. So you always want to make sure there's like one person whose job it is to watch the kids. And if they have to stop, they have to find another one person. I feel like we're not quite to that point with safety and whatnot in AI.
Right
So
on.
maybe kind of wrapping up the conversation with a round robin of kind of quick hits. What is an area of challenges that you feel like hasn't been solved yet? So we talked a lot about identity. So let's try to pick something else. I'm happy to start here. I was just chatting with a group of ETH Zurich PhDs on what does an agent safety platform look like, right? Obviously, auth is going to be a huge factor because if agents are going to perform actions, right, we talked about data, on applications, on systems records, right, on behalf of individuals, what permissions are they going to require? Privileges are they going to require? And how are you going to make sure that is all approved, right? We talk about AppSec, right? That's also going to be applicable for agents. So we talked in that company, of course, if you're curious in checking it out, it's called Invariant Labs. Their founders were just in San Francisco for meetings this week. So that's something that's top of mind for me because if we're going to use agents in use cases like LLMs for the SOC, for example, or to replace other security analysts, security engineers, right? It's going to be an important question.
Yeah. I have two in addition to identity. I think application security, code security, like putting less vulnerabilities out there in the world continues to be unsolved. I know there's a lot of companies out there, there's a lot of technology, but the reality is it's obviously unsolved. I think maybe AI can help with that. And the other one I would say that is unsolved is DLP. Obviously, there are a lot of solutions out there, but they have so many false positives. They don't have the context that most of the people I talk to who have a DLP, if you actually ask them, are you happy with it? You get this really depressed look on their face and they're like, no, but it's kind of where it is. And so I think also AI might be able to help with that because it's good at parsing and maybe getting context. But those are two things that I think are honestly even relatively mature markets that don't seem to be effective enough currently.
Yeah, so I would say a little bit related, but not exactly in the core security space, which I feel has potential impact for disruption and opportunity is the idea of fraud because of deepfakes. I think this trend it's a secular trend that's bound to become bigger. I don't think the problem has become big enough yet to see a lot of investment dollars go there, but it's on the horizon. I think this thing is way more interesting from a fraud standpoint than anything out there has happened so far.
I'll go with two. I'm going to add to maybe a broader version of your fraud point, Ashish. I think it's a really, really interesting space right now. I think there are people who are thinking about, especially using LLMs to tackle fraud. And I think there's an interesting incentive alignment there where you can get data sharing and potentially become an aggregator of some interesting data to de-risk fraud because the incentives line up more cleanly than many other spaces. So I think there's something interesting coming there. My second one, I'll make it a little more out there. It's something we're thinking about a lot. I don't think the security portion of it is tractable in the sort of short term, but maybe in the medium term, which is you look at the history of computing, there's this like sort of oscillation between centralized, decentralized in some form, or sort of concentrated and diffuse in some form. And one thing we think has been happening for a couple of years and is sort of accelerating in some ways is a little bit of a transition from cloud to edge in many cases. And especially if you think about it in the context of AI, I mean, there's obviously a lot of investment in things like data centers for training purposes, but there's a whole inference question. And I believe pretty strongly if you're going to build intelligent machines, you can't wait till they make their API calls and it comes back over a high latency connection. And you're already seeing that be an issue with some of the sort of first wave of quote unquote AI hardware. And so a lot of inference we think is going to happen at the edge, and that's going to drive our new hardware cycle. That has some pretty interesting security implications if you're doing inference at the edge. So it's one of those things where I think the architecture has quite a ways to go. That might be a year or two before that really becomes a big problem, but it's coming.
Yeah, on that note, I have to jump to my next meeting, and inference on the edge security implications was a very small piece of our episode on computing on the edge. So I would love to follow up on that conversation and pick your brains on that because I was lost. So maybe you have something there.
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation, and thank you for also organically giving a plug to our latest Edge security episode.
Yeah.
This was really fun. Good to see you both.
Likewise, appreciate
Great
the time.
Cheers.